I had been counting down the days to this weekend for months. The office stress, the constant emails, the never-ending HOA newsletters. I needed a break. So I packed my gear, loaded up the truck, and drove the winding roads until I reached my little slice of heaven, my lake cabin. The moment I stepped out of the truck, the air hit me crisp, clean, and slightly damp with morning mist. The lake shimmered under the early sun, fog curling just above the water like a whisper of calm. I breathed in, holding the cup of coffee I'd made in the cabin kitchen, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, pure, uninterrupted peace. I lowered myself onto the old wooden dock, letting my bare feet brush against the rough planks. The sound of water lapping against the shore was hypnotic, and I smiled as I set up my fishing rod. This was supposed to be simple, a quiet weekend of casting lines, reading a book, maybe catching a fish or two. No deadlines, no neighbors poking over the fence, no HOA drama, just me and the lake. But as I settled into my little bubble of calm, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A bright flash of color on the opposite shore caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a jacket left on a chair, maybe a jogger in the distance. But then I realized it was her, Karen. I froze. Of course it had to be Karen. The self-appointed neighborhood enforcer, the HOA president who seemed to live for citing obscure rules and fining people for enjoying their own property. And there she was, striding toward me like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, her signature pink tracksuit almost glowing against the greenery. I tried to ignore her. Maybe if I acted normal, she'd just turn around and leave. I cast my line again, hoping she'd pass by. But no. She stopped at the edge of the dock, arms crossed, tapping her foot like she had rehearsed this confrontation in her mirror that morning. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning calm. "You're violating HOA rules." I blinked. "I'm violating rules." "Yes," she said, flipping her clipboard toward me like it was a shield. "Camping tents, fishing before sunrise, you know the rules." I stared at her, coffee in one hand, fishing rod in the other, trying to process the absurdity. I owned this property. I had paid taxes on this lakefront paradise, maintained it, and yet here was Karen, acting like a sheriff ready to arrest me for daring to enjoy my own weekend. "Look," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, "I live here. This is my property. I'm just relaxing." Karen didn't flinch. In fact, she straightened, glaring at me with a mixture of authority and glee. "Relaxing doesn't mean breaking rules. You're going to have to take that tent down and then she pulled out her phone. 911, she muttered under her breath. "This is a clear violation. Yes, I'm at the lake on East Shore Drive. No, I'm not exaggerating." I felt a bubble of panic rise in my chest, mixed with disbelief and honestly a little amusement. She was actually calling the cops on me, on my own property, for camping. I looked around. The dock, the trees, the calm lake, it felt surreal, like the world had shifted into a ridiculous episode of some reality TV show. Neighbors could be peeking over the hill, cameras and phones ready to capture Karen's next dramatic move. And me? I was standing there, coffee in hand, wondering if I should have just stayed home and binge-watched TV instead. The sun rose higher, glinting off the water, and I knew this was no ordinary weekend. Karen's obsession with rules was about to turn my peaceful escape into a full-blown standoff. And the worst part, I couldn't even leave. This was my lake, my dock, my cabin. I couldn't exactly pack up and drive away while the self-proclaimed HOA police enforced a law that didn't exist. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the fishing rod, and tried to prepare myself. Little did I know, the next few hours would test my patience, my sanity, and my ability to stay calm in the face of pure, unfiltered Karen energy. Because one thing was certain, my quiet weekend was over. I barely had time to sip my coffee before I saw her striding down the path toward my dock, her clipboard clutched like it was a weapon, pink tracksuit glowing in the morning sun. She moved with that unmistakable mix of purpose and self-righteous fury that only Karen could perfect, a mix that made everyone around her feel like a character in her personal drama. "Excuse me," she shouted, her voice bouncing off the lake like an overenthusiastic school principal. "You are in direct violation of HOA rules." I leaned back on the dock, fishing rod dangling loosely, trying to understand how someone could actually be upset about a weekend on your own property. I'm fishing," I said slowly. "This is my land. I own this lake." Her eyes narrowed. "Ownership does not exempt you from the rules," she snapped. "Tent on the property, fishing before sunrise, campfire on the lake shore, it's all illegal." I blinked. Fishing before sunrise was illegal. I hadn't gotten the memo. And a campfire, I hadn't even thought about lighting one yet. But it was her delivery, her certainty that made it clear. In her world, she was judge, jury, and executioner, and I was standing in the defendant's chair. She started packing back and forth, muttering rule numbers under her breath, flipping pages on the clipboard like a courtroom stenographer. I watched in equal parts disbelief and amusement. I had never seen anyone so committed to policing someone else's life. I almost laughed, except that she was clearly serious. Then came the real kicker. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. Yes, 911, she muttered, tapping her foot, eyes darting toward me with a smug grin. We have a blatant violation of HOA regulations, private property, East Shore Drive. No, I'm not exaggerating. Yes, they're camping illegally on their own lake. I froze, coffee halfway to my lips. She was calling the cops on me on my own property. Karen, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You do realize this is my property, right? I'm allowed to camp here. I pay taxes on this land. You don't have the authority to. She cut me off mid-sentence. Authority isn't the point, rules are the point, and you are breaking them right now. Her enthusiasm was almost theatrical, like she was performing for an invisible audience. I couldn't tell if she was mad, proud, or just enjoying the drama, probably all three. I glanced around nervously. From the hill above, I thought I saw a neighbor's head peeking out. If they were filming, this was going to be a viral moment. A man standing on his dock, facing off with HOA Karen over fishing rights. It sounded absurd when I said it out loud, but there I was, living it. Trying to diffuse things, I raised my hands. Look, Karen, I don't want trouble. I just came out here for a quiet weekend. I'm not trying to break rules. I'm just fishing. Please, can we just talk about this calmly? She snorted dismissive. Talk, oh, we'll talk, but first the authorities need to be involved. I'm reporting this immediately. By this point, my heart was racing. The peaceful weekend I had imagined had vanished. Instead, I was in the middle of a potential standoff with a woman who seemed incapable of understanding logic, armed with a clipboard, a phone, and a single-minded determination to enforce rules that didn't apply. I tried to reason again. Karen, it's literally my land. You can't call the cops for me enjoying it. She didn't listen. She marched a few steps closer, clipboard waving. Rules are rules. You'll see what happens. You might think you own this lake, but I will make sure this is handled properly. Authorities will decide. I stared at her, fishing rod slipping slightly from my sweaty hands. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, like the calm lake had turned into a powder keg. I couldn't leave. I couldn't just let her escalate, and I couldn't imagine how it would look when the cops showed up. And then I realized the worst part. Even if the cops sided with me, Karen wasn't done. She never was. This was just the beginning. The overzealous, obsessive, rule-loving HOA Karen had set her sights on me, and there was no telling what she might try next. I tightened my grip on the fishing rod and braced myself. My weekend was officially over. And yet somehow, I knew this confrontation was going to be memorable. I was still trying to convince myself this was some kind of bizarre prank when the first distant wail of a siren cut through the morning calm. My stomach dropped like a rock. Karen's, I muttered under my breath, gripping the fishing rod like it was a lifeline. You did. But of course she had. She had called 911 on me on my own property, and now the authorities were on their way. I scanned the lake, half expecting a helicopter to descend, half hoping my imagination was exaggerating things. But no, the sirens grew louder, bouncing off the water and the surrounding trees. From the hill above, a few neighbors had gathered, peeking over fences and whispering to each other. Some were laughing quietly, some were wide-eyed in disbelief. I couldn't blame them. If they weren't watching in person, they would have sworn it was staged. A man, a fishing rod, a calm lake, and one overzealous HOA president calling the police like a storm had broken out. Karen was grinning now, phone still pressed to her ear. Yes, they're still here. Yes, they're clearly violating rules. No, I'm not exaggerating, she said, packing back and forth. She didn't even notice me staring at her with a mix of disbelief and growing panic. I tried to keep my composure. I mean, I had spent years navigating office politics. Surely I could handle an overzealous neighbor. But this was different. This wasn't HR. This was a lake, my dock, and a woman who seemed to thrive on tension. The first police car turned onto the dirt road, and I swear the world slowed down for a moment. One officer got out, walking toward me with a careful mix of authority and caution. Behind him, another car rolled in, lights flashing, and I realized this was really happening. I wasn't imagining it. My peaceful weekend had turned into a live-action sitcom. Karen immediately started waving her clipboard, running toward the officers. They're camping illegally, violating HOA rules. I'm the witness, she shouted like a courtroom prosecutor. The first officer, a tall man with a calm face, raised his hand to slow her down. Ma'am, please, we'll assess the situation. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Officer, I live here, I own this property, I'm not violating any law, this is my lake, my cabin, my dock. Karen shot me a look like I had just insulted her personally. Not so fast, they're clearly ignoring the rules, I have proof, citations, and a full record of previous violations. The officer tilted his head, scanning her papers briefly, then looked at me. Sir, can you show us any proof of ownership? Relief and disbelief collided in my chest. I have the deeds, tax records, everything, I said, fishing the documents from my cabin bag and handing them over. Karen scoffed audibly, clearly expecting the police to side with her. That doesn't matter, they're flaunting the rules and something needs to be done. Meanwhile, my inner monologue was running at full speed. Flaunting the rules, I'm sitting here fishing while she's acting like she's running some national security operation. How is this happening? The officers examined my papers carefully, nodding at the legitimacy. One of them even raised an eyebrow at Karen's frantic gestures. I could see the doubt forming in her eyes, the first crack in her overconfident armor. Still, the tension didn't disappear. Karen leaned in, voice rising. They might own the property, but the HOA rules still apply, you need to make them comply. I felt a pang of disbelief. Comply with what? Not enjoying my own lake, not existing. Then the officer turned to Karen, very calm, and said words I had been hopping for. Ma'am, as long as he owns the property and isn't violating local ordinances, there's nothing we can enforce here. HOA rules do not override property rights. Her face went from confident to a mix of shock and fury in a matter of seconds. She opened her mouth, probably to argue further, but the officer had already given me a look that said, "This is under control." For a moment I just stood there dumbfounded. The sirens faded, neighbors exchanged amused glances, and the lake returned to its peaceful rhythm. I took a shaky breath and let my fishing rod rest against my shoulder. My weekend might still be salvaged, maybe. But Karen, she wasn't going anywhere quietly. I could see it in her eyes. She was already plotting her next move, ready to escalate, ready to make my life more complicated. I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of what would become the most absurd, frustrating, and ridiculous weekend of my life. The officers stayed for a moment longer, scanning the area and looking between Karen and me like they were trying to understand how a calm lake could suddenly become a battlefield. I kept my hands in sight, my fishing rod leaning against the dock, my heart still pounding. Karen, of course, was undeterred. She adjusted her clipboard, cleared her throat, and began her next argument, this time louder, more dramatic. Sir, she said, pointing at me, you might own the property, but you're endangering the neighborhood. What if someone gets hurt? What if there's a fire? There are rules, and you're flaunting them. I tried to hold back laughter. Endangering the neighborhood? The only thing in danger here is Karen's ego. I forced myself to keep a calm tone. Officer, she's making a lot of claims, but none of them have anything to do with actual laws. I'm just fishing. I haven't started a fire. No one's in danger. It's my property. The officers exchanged glances, their calm professionalism contrasting sharply with Karen's escalating theatrics. I noticed the first officer subtly shaking his head at her, almost like he couldn't believe this was a real complaint. Karen, sensing the officers weren't entirely on her side, began packing back and forth like a caged tiger. I'm doing my duty, I'm protecting the neighborhood, you have to enforce the rules. At that moment, a gentle breeze rippled across the lake, ruffling the surface and making the whole scene feel surreal, like a movie set where the stakes were absurdly high for no real reason. I couldn't resist the inner monologue running through my head. If this were a TV show, they'd cut to a commercial break right now, but no, this is real life, unfortunately. I tried reasoning one more time. Karen, please, the rules you're citing are HOA guidelines, not laws. I pay property taxes here, I maintain this land. You have no legal authority to enforce these so-called rules against me. Karen leaned closer, voice rising. That's exactly what they all say, until fines start piling up, until the HOA takes action, you'll see you can't ignore this forever. The second officer finally stepped in, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, we're here to ensure safety and enforce the law. HOA disputes aren't within our jurisdiction. If he's not violating local ordinances, there's nothing we can do. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker in her expression. I almost felt bad, almost. Nope, not even a little. Then, just to drive the point home, the officer turned to me. Sir, as long as your activities are legal, you have every right to be here. You don't need to comply with HOA fines or rules beyond what the law requires. Relief washed over me and I took a step back, letting the dock creak under my weight. My weekend might still be saved. I glanced at the water, trying to imagine casting my line again, finally enjoying the peace I had been craving. Karen, however, was far from finished. She pulled out another sheet of paper from her clipboard and waved it dramatically. "You think this is over? You'll regret this. The HOA has records of prior incidents. They can escalate. You're not going to get away with this." I looked at her, sipping my coffee slowly now, as if to punctuate the absurdity of it all. Regret? I think the only person regretting anything right now is Karen. The officers, clearly unimpressed, started stepping back toward their vehicles. Karen, in a final act of defiance, stomped her foot and shouted, "This isn't over." I watched her storm away, muttering and gesturing wildly. The neighbors on the hill chuckled quietly, some snapping pictures or videos with their phones. I couldn't help but shake my head. Only in my life would a weekend getaway turn into a confrontation worthy of national news. I let out a slow breath, finally picking up my fishing rod again. The lake looked the same, serene and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. And yet I knew better. Karen wasn't done. She had the energy of a hurricane and the obsession of a hawk. My weekend was far from over, and I had a feeling that if I wanted to enjoy my lake in peace, I was going to have to stand my ground, handle her antics, and maybe, just maybe, outsmart one of the most relentless HOA presidents in history. Because as I watched her disappear down the path, muttering to herself, I realized this wasn't just about fishing or a tent. It was about proving that I wasn't going to let someone dictate my life on land I had earned. And for the first time, I felt the stirrings of determination. If this was a battle I wasn't going to lose, not here, not on my dock, not on my lake. I thought the confrontation on the dock might have been the climax of Karen's performance. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong, so very wrong. Later that morning, I settled back on the dock, fishing rod in hand, trying to ignore the adrenaline still pulsing through my veins. The water was calm, the birds were chirping, and for a moment I almost believed I could salvage the weekend. Almost. But then I heard the unmistakable crunch of sneakers on gravel, and I knew it was her. Karen had returned, armed with an arsenal of HOA documentation, each sheet more ridiculous than the last. She flopped down on the edge of the dock, slapping the clipboard on the planks like she was ready to perform a ceremonial declaration of guilt. "You think this is over?" she demanded. "Do you even understand what you're doing? You're flaunting HOA rules that apply to everyone, and yes, that includes you." I raised an eyebrow, gripping my coffee. Which rules are those exactly? Not fishing, not enjoying my own property, not existing before sunrise. Karen gasped, as if I had committed the ultimate crime by questioning her authority. "Don't mock me, these are serious matters. You could face fines, legal action. The HOA doesn't take this lightly." I leaned back, letting the absurdity sink in. Fines, legal action, for fishing on my own lake? I suppressed a laugh, imagining the look on the judge's face when Karen tried to explain this in court. I swear it would be a mix of disbelief, pity, and maybe a little eye-rolling. She began flipping through the pages of her stack, pointing to arbitrary rule numbers, citing obscure clauses that I'm pretty sure she had made up in her sleep. Rule 12.3, and no tents within 50 feet of the dock. Rule 14.2b, fishing before sunrise requires HOA approval. Rule 19.6c, unauthorized use of private lake for camping. I stopped her mid-gesture. "Karen, I read all that. Honestly, I'm impressed you memorized it. But these aren't laws. I pay property taxes, I maintain this land, and I have full ownership. The HOA can't enforce their guidelines against me in this way." Her eyes narrowed and she leaned in, lowering her voice like a soap opera villain. "You think ownership gives you a free pass? You're wrong. You're setting a dangerous precedent. If the rules aren't enforced here, they won't be enforced anywhere. This could spiral out of control." I let out a slow breath, trying to remain calm. Dangerous precedent? I'm sitting here on my dock, drinking coffee, waiting for a fish to bite. The only thing spiraling out of control is your imagination. Karen's face flushed a deep red, and she started packing in small circles, tapping her pen on the clipboard like a gavel. I could almost hear the little ding in my head. This is peak Karen energy. Then came the escalation. "I'm going to file a formal complaint," she said, voice rising. "This will go to the HOA board, fines will be imposed, and legal action could follow. You won't get away with this." I tilted my head, trying to mask my disbelief. Karen, fines for camping on my own lake? I didn't know the HOA had a monopoly on common sense. She paused for a moment, glaring daggers at me. "This is serious, you'll regret ignoring the rules." I let her stew for a moment, taking a sip of coffee, savoring the absurdity. Then I spoke, calm but firm. Karen, I understand that you enjoy enforcing rules, but I also understand my rights. You cannot fine me for enjoying my property. You cannot call the law on me for fishing or camping here. The rules end where my property begins. Her jaw tightened. I could see the gears turning in that relentless mind of hers, plotting her next move. And I realized something important. This wasn't going to end quietly. She would escalate, send letters, call neighbors, maybe even try to bring in lawyers. She thrived on this drama. I looked back at the lake, the water calm and glistening, and I felt a small surge of determination. I wasn't going to let her win, not this weekend, not on my dock, not on my lake. Because while Karen may have rules, papers, and a clipboard, I had the truth, and that truth was clear. This was my land, my weekend, and I wasn't going anywhere. And I had a feeling the next move would test every ounce of patience I had left. After Karen stormed off temporarily, I hoped, I finally sank back onto the dock, coffee in hand, letting the tension slowly seep out of my shoulders. My lake was quiet again, the ripples of the water reflecting the sun in a dazzling shimmer. But the momentary peace was deceptive. I knew Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. As I sat there, I realized that I couldn't just rely on common sense or hope she'd see reason. Karen thrived on paperwork, citations, and the illusion of power. If I wanted to survive this, I needed to arm myself, not with a fishing rod, but with knowledge. I retreated to my cabin and pulled out my laptop, determined to figure out exactly how much authority an HOA president could legally wield. I dug into property laws, HOA regulations, and past legal cases. The deeper I got, the more I realized something obvious but oddly satisfying. Karen's entire argument rested on a bluff. The HOA could suggest fines, send letters, even threaten legal action, but they couldn't enforce anything beyond what the law allowed. And since this lake, this dock, and this cabin were mine, well, she had no real power here. I made notes, highlighted key sections, and even printed out copies of my property deeds, local ordinances, and legal references regarding HOA limitations. I arranged them neatly in a folder, my own little arsenal. Karen might have rules and paperwork, but I had law, facts, and a calm mind. As I worked, my thoughts drifted back to the dock confrontation. I couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity of it all. Here I am, a normal person trying to enjoy a lake weekend, and I'm being treated like some rogue outlaw by a woman in a pink tracksuit. I shook my head. This wasn't just ridiculous, it was peak Karen energy. Around mid-morning, I peeked outside. She was back, lurking at the edge of the property line, clearly scouting, muttering to herself while checking her phone. I could see the determination in her posture. She wasn't going to give up. But now I had the upper hand. I knew her rules were meaningless if I could calmly, legally, and confidently demonstrate my rights. I grabbed my folder and stepped back onto the dock where the lake stretched peacefully before me. The sun glinted off the water, and for the first time that day, I felt a flicker of hope. Karen might try to intimidate, but I had a plan. I wasn't going to react emotionally, I was going to respond strategically. Then came the first test. Karen marched up, clipboard raised, ready to launch another dramatic declaration. You're going to pay for this. I've already contacted the board. They're going to escalate this to the highest level. I opened my folder and calmly held up my documents. Karen, I've done my homework. I understand the rules, I understand the law, and I know my rights. The HOA cannot enforce fines on my private property. You can threaten all you want, but there's no legal backing for what you're doing. For a moment, I saw the first flicker of doubt in her eyes. She opened her mouth, clearly searching for a rebuttal, but nothing came. I continued, holding my calm and letting my words land like stones in the water. If you escalate this further, it will only highlight the absurdity of your claims. I suggest we handle this reasonably, or I will have no choice but to involve legal counsel. Her glare was sharp, but it wavered ever so slightly. I knew this wasn't over, but now I had shifted the balance. The fight wasn't about intimidation anymore, it was about facts and patience. And for the first time that day, I felt like I might actually have a chance to reclaim my weekend. I leaned back against the dock, sipping my coffee, and allowed myself a small, victorious smile. Karen was relentless, obsessive, and completely certain of her own power, but I was calm, prepared, and armed with the truth. The lake reflected the sky, serene as ever, but I knew the storm was coming. Karen wouldn't stop at paperwork, she would escalate, she would plot, and she would try to reclaim the imaginary power she thought she had over my life. But now I was ready. I had the knowledge, the documents, and the patience to face her. And I was confident that when the next showdown came, I would not only survive, it was time to push back. Because some battles aren't won by force or fury. They're won by understanding the rules, knowing your rights, and standing firm while your opponent collapses under their own obsession. And Karen, she was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The next morning, I woke up to the gentle sound of water lapping against the dock, hopping against hope that Karen had finally retreated. But deep down, I knew better. Her obsession with rules, power, and drama wouldn't let her rest. And sure enough, by mid-morning, she was back, this time carrying a fresh stack of papers and flanked by two of her more nervous HOA friends who looked like they weren't entirely sure why they were involved in this madness. Karen marched onto my dock like a general leading an army into battle. "You think you can ignore the rules?" she demanded, clipboard in hand, voice sharper than ever. "This ends today. The HOA board will see that you are in violation and you will be held accountable." I took a deep breath and reminded myself to stay calm. This was the moment I had been preparing for. I set my coffee down, opened my folder of documents, and calmly looked her in the eyes. "Karen, I've done my research and I understand my rights. The HOA cannot enforce rules on my private property beyond what the law allows. Your threats are empty and your complaints have no legal weight here." Her face twisted in fury, and I could see the gears turning in that relentless mind of hers. She tried to interrupt, waving a paper for emphasis. "You can't just." "Please," I said, holding up a hand. "Let be clear, I am within my legal rights, you are not. This is my property, and I will continue to enjoy it peacefully. Any further action on your part that interferes with that enjoyment will be documented and could result in legal consequences for you personally." Her mouth opened, then closed, as if she had just realized that the confident script she had rehearsed in her head didn't apply in reality. I could almost hear the mental gears grinding. Her plan for intimidation was crumbling, and the more she tried to push, the weaker her position became. I glanced at the two HOA friends behind her. They looked nervous, shuffling their feet, clearly unsure how to proceed. Karen's confidence had been a force of nature in the past, but now, without the illusion of authority over me, she was floundering. Then came the subtle twist that made the confrontation cinematic. A local officer who had been driving by slowed down and called out, "Sir, ma'am, everything's calm here." Karen's eyes darted to him, panic flashing across her face. "Yes, he's violating HOA rules," she shouted, voice tight. "I'm just trying to." The officer gave a polite but firm shake of his head. "Ma'am, we can't enforce HOA rules. He's on private property and there's no local ordinance being broken. I suggest you step back and avoid further escalation." The final crack appeared in her armor. Her shoulders slumped slightly and her confident smirk faltered. She realized she had been overplaying her hand, and now the evidence was stacked against her, me calm and collected, legally prepared, and the law clearly on my side. I seized the moment, keeping my tone firm but calm. "Karen, this ends here. You've had your say, and now you need to leave. Any further harassment or attempts to interfere with my property will be documented." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She muttered something under her breath, muttering about the board rules and how she would fix this, but the fight had left her. She walked away, two HOA friends trailing behind, looking dejected. I watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and triumph. The dock was quiet again, the lake stretching peacefully before me as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had changed. I had stood my ground, confronted absurdity with facts, and reclaimed my weekend. I leaned back, coffee in hand, letting the sun warm my face. The lake reflected the sky, serene and undisturbed, but I couldn't help smiling. Karen's obsession had met its match, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt the satisfaction of victory, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through preparation, patience, and the quiet power of knowing your rights. As I cast my line back into the water, the tension slowly drained from my shoulders. The sun sparkled on the lake, the birds returned to their songs, and the water rippled gently against the dock. Peace, finally, had returned. But one lesson was clear: some battles aren't won by force. They're won by understanding the rules, standing firm, and letting the other person collapse under the weight of their own obsession. In Karen, she would probably come back with another plan someday, but for now, I had my lake, my weekend, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had outlasted the storm. The lake was quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you appreciate every ripple, every bird call, every subtle whisper of wind through the trees. I sat on the dock, fishing rod in hand, but this time I didn't just fish, I soaked it all in. The tension from the past few days had finally begun to melt away. Karen was gone for now. The HOA friends who had once followed her like dutiful soldiers had slinked back into the shadows, their confidence drained by the reality of the law and my calm persistence. I had won not by shouting, not by fighting, but by understanding my rights, standing my ground, and letting the absurdity of her obsession implode on its own. I took a slow sip of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I could finally laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. A woman had called 911 on me for camping and fishing on my own property. She had waved a clipboard like it was a weapon of mass destruction. And yet here I was, still calm, still in control, and still enjoying the lake that was mine. I reflected on the standoff, on the way Karen had believed rules and regulations gave her power that they simply didn't. It was almost sad in a way. She had devoted herself to policing other people's lives, imagining herself a hero of order when in reality her authority stopped at the edges of someone else's property. And yet there she had been, fully convinced that she could bend reality to her will. I glanced at my fishing line, and this time I let a small smile spread across my face. I had patience, I had strategy, I had facts, and above all I had my lake. No amount of rules or threats could take that from me. A gentle breeze rippled the water and I leaned back, letting my gaze wander across the lake. The morning sun reflected in glimmers across the surface, and for the first time in days, everything felt simple and calm. I realized that this battle, ridiculous as it had been, had taught me something valuable. Some conflicts aren't about who yells louder or who waves the clipboard higher. They're about knowing your rights, keeping your cool, and letting the truth speak for itself. Karen had tried to intimidate me, but she had underestimated the power of preparation, patience, and calm resolve. I thought about the neighbors who had peered over the hill, curious, amused, and maybe a little confused by the spectacle. I imagined them retelling the story, a man, a lake, a pink tracksuit, and a clipboard-fueled vendetta that ended with nothing but the quiet triumph of reason. I chuckled quietly. Some things really are better in hindsight. And yet I knew this wasn't the last I would see of Karen. She thrived on escalation, drama, and the illusion of authority, but I also knew I had the upper hand. I had learned her patterns, understood her obsession, and most importantly, stayed calm when chaos threatened to swallow me. That knowledge alone gave me a quiet kind of power, one she could never take from me. I cast my line into the water once more, watching the ripples spread across the surface. The lake, my lake, remained untouched by the absurdity that had nearly consumed it. Birds soared overhead, the sun climbed higher, and the gentle lapping of water against the dock reminded me why I had come here in the first place. Peace, quiet, and a sense of freedom that no rule or complaint could ever take away. Leaning back, I let the warmth of the sun and the calm of the lake fill me. I had fought, I had stood my ground, and I had won. And in that victory, I found more than just the weekend I had planned. I found the satisfaction of knowing that reason, preparation, and patience can triumph over obsession and drama. Karen may come back, she may try again, but I will be ready. And next time I will face her with the same calm, the same knowledge, and the same quiet determination that had carried me through this absurd battle. For now, though, I smiled, feeling the sun on my face and the water at my feet, and finally allowed myself to enjoy the weekend I had earned. Peace, serenity, and my lake, untainted, untouchable, and undeniably mine. Sometimes victory isn't about fighting. It's about standing firm, knowing your worth, and letting the other person unravel themselves in the process. And that, I realized with a contented sigh, was the best kind of victory of all. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.